Ma'am, step away from the desk right now.
Excuse me? I'm in the middle of class. What is this about?
We received a tip. You need to come with us.
A tip for what? I'm an elementary school teacher. I work here.
We'll sort that out outside. Turn
around.
A
tip had come in stating a non-white teacher in a classroom with a possible identity issue. Officer Curtis Ray believed this was routine as usual. In his mind, that was enough to act and demand answers. He had relied on the same logic and done this before, assuming this same compliance. Authority first, then questions come later. If at all, he and 4 other officers stepped into an elementary school classroom that morning, walking past rows of children, and confronted the woman at the front of the room as if the classroom were a checkpoint. Beatrice Dillon, an American-born elementary school teacher, understood immediately what was happening. She stated who she was, where she was born, and what she did for a living. And then she asked the only question that mattered. What law had she broken? That single question changed the trajectory of how her day went. She never expected this, even in her wildest dreams. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Now let's continue. The classroom had settled into that familiar late morning rhythm where pencils moved steadily, chairs no longer scraped, and children worked with a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what was expected of them. Sunlight spilled through the windows along the right wall, filtered by half-drawn blinds, laying pale stripes across desks arranged in tidy rows. Worksheets sat squarely in front of each child. A few backpacks hung from chair backs. The room smelled faintly of paper, pencil shavings, and dry erase markers. Beatrice Dillon stood near the whiteboard, a stack of graded papers in one hand, the other gesturing gently as she explained a math problem. Her voice was calm, measured, familiar to the students who had heard it every school day since August. She wore a blazer over a blouse, professional but practical, a lanyard hanging from her neck with her school identification card resting against her chest. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency, let alone danger. Then the door opened. Not the soft knock she expected when an aide needed something, nor the cautious entrance of a substitute teacher asking for directions. The door swung inward with purpose. Heavy shoes crossed the threshold. The sound alone cut through the room's quiet, and several children looked up at once. 5 uniformed officers entered the classroom in a line that felt rehearsed, although it likely was not. Curtis Ray stepped in first, his posture rigid, his gaze already fixed on Beatrice. Logan Lowry followed close behind, then Roland Hawkins, Beck Colton, and Edward Brandt. They did not pause to take in the room. They did not acknowledge the children. They did not look for the principal's office or ask the nearest adult where to go. They walked straight toward the front of the classroom as if they had every right to be there. Beatrice stopped mid-sentence. The students noticed before she did what this meant. The chair shifted. A pencil rolled off a desk and clattered against the floor, louder than it should have been. One child whispered her name, barely audible. Curtis Ray spoke first. "We need to see your papers." The words landed awkwardly, not because they were shouted, but because they did not belong in that space. Beatrice blinked once, then set the stack of papers down on the edge of her desk. She looked at Curtis, then briefly at the other officers, as if expecting someone to clarify what she had just heard. "My papers?" she asked, not defensively, but because the phrase made no sense. Curtis did not soften his tone. "Identification. Proof of citizenship." The room went still. Children stopped writing. Several stared openly now, eyes wide, confusion spreading from desk to desk. Beatrice felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was not a misplaced visit. Something else was happening. "I'm the teacher," she said. "I work here." Curtis did not respond to that statement. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the space between them without raising his voice. "We receive a tip," he said. "You need to show us your papers." Beatrice straightened. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she kept her shoulders squared. What tip? She asked. What law have I broken? Curtis did not answer either question. Instead, he repeated himself. Turn around. A murmur rippled through the room. One child near the back leaned toward another and whispered, Why are they here? Another stared at Beatrice with an expression that mixed fear and disbelief, as if waiting for her to fix something she had not broken. Beatrice did not turn around. I'm a United States citizen, she said clearly, carefully. I was born here. I teach here. You can speak to the principal. Curtis exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound barely noticeable but sharp enough to register. We don't need the principal. We need your papers. The word hung in the air again. Papers. As if this were a checkpoint. As if this were not an elementary school classroom filled with children who trusted the adults around them to behave rationally. Beatrice glanced briefly toward the students, then back at Curtis. I'm not carrying a birth certificate in my classroom, she said. No one does. Curtis's jaw tightened. That's not my problem. Beatrice had not planned to teach a civics lesson that morning. She had planned to go over fractions, to collect homework, to remind two students to stop tapping their desks. Yet standing there, facing a demand that carried no explanation, she felt the weight of something far larger than her own discomfort. Before I turn around, she said, I need to know what you're accusing me of. Curtis frowned. We're not accusing you of anything. Then why are you detaining me? She asked. The word detaining mattered. Beatrice knew that. The Constitution did not require magic words, but it did require clarity. If she was not free to walk away, then she was being detained. And if she was being detained, the law imposed conditions on the officer, not on her. Curtis shifted his stance. This is a routine verification. There is no such thing, Beatrice replied, although she kept her voice level. Not without reasonable suspicion. The children did not understand the phrase, but they understood the tension. A boy near the window leaned back in his chair, eyes darting between the adults. Curtis scoffed. We got a complaint. That's enough. No, Beatrice said. It isn't. The Fourth Amendment is not complicated, although it is often treated as if it were. It does not forbid police from asking questions. It does not prevent officers from speaking to people in public places. What it does require is justification when an encounter becomes compulsory. An officer may approach. An officer may ask. But an officer may not detain a person, demand identification, or restrict movement unless there is reasonable suspicion that the person is involved in criminal activity. That suspicion must be based on specific, articulable facts, not vague impressions, not generalizations, and not discomfort. Beatrice understood this because she had learned it the same way many professionals learn it, through necessity rather than theory. She had watched colleagues questioned in stores, friends stopped on sidewalks, family members asked to prove belonging in spaces they had occupied all their lives. She had paid attention because she could not afford not to. Reasonable suspicion of what? She asked. What crime? Curtis did not answer. He glanced briefly at Logan Lowry, then back at Beatrice. You're being uncooperative. I'm asserting my rights, she replied. There's a difference. The Fourth Amendment protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures. A seizure occurs not only when handcuffs come out, but when an officer's authority makes a reasonable person feel they are not free to leave. Beatrice knew that. Curtis should have known it too. Unless you can tell me what law you believe I've broken, she said, you cannot demand my identification. Curtis's face reddened slightly. The children noticed that too. Authority, when challenged, often reacts emotionally before it reacts legally. Ma'am, he said, if you have nothing to hide, you'll comply. That sentence, delivered so often across the country, carried no legal meaning at all. Compliance is not the standard. Suspicion is. And suspicion cannot be manufactured simply because an officer expects obedience. I'm not required to prove my citizenship to you, Beatrice said. Not here. Not like this. The room felt smaller. Curtis's shadow stretched across the floor, darkening the space between them. The children sat frozen, learning something no worksheet could teach them. Curtis finally offered what he seemed to believe was an explanation. "We received an anonymous tip," he said, "that there was someone working here who might not be authorized." Beatrice inhaled slowly. "Anonymous," she repeated. "So you don't know who made it?" "That doesn't matter." "It does," she replied. "It matters a great deal. Anonymous tips occupy a narrow space in the law. They can prompt investigation, but they cannot, by themselves, justify detention. The Supreme Court has been clear on this point for decades. A tip without predictive information, without verifiable detail, without evidence that the caller has reliable knowledge, does not create reasonable suspicion. A tip that says someone is suspicious because of how they look is not a tip. It is bias disguised as concern. "What exactly did the tip say?" Beatrice asked. Curtis hesitated. "That someone here might be using false identification." "Who?" she asked. "You." "Based on what?" she pressed. Curtis did not respond. Behind him, Beck Colton shifted his weight. Roland Hawkins stared at the floor. Edward Brand's gaze flicked briefly toward the students, then away again. None spoke. An anonymous tip should have sent Curtis to the administration office. It should have prompted a conversation with the principal, a review of employment records, a phone call to human resources. Schools do not hire teachers without documentation. Background checks are mandatory. Licenses are verified. Employment authorization is handled by employers, not by officers interrogating individuals in front of children. "What you're doing," Beatrice said, "is skipping every lawful step." Curtis bristled. "We're allowed to investigate." "Yes," she said, "but investigation does not mean interrogation without cause, and it does not mean humiliation." The children watched the exchange with an intensity that made Beatrice's chest tighten. These were students who trusted adults to follow rules, who were taught that rules mattered because they were fair. "An anonymous accusation," she continued, "does not give you the right to detain me. It doesn't matter if the caller felt uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if they used certain words. You still need facts." Curtis took another step forward. "This doesn't need to be difficult." "It became difficult the moment you walked into my classroom," Beatrice replied. "Instead of the office." The truth was simple. Curtis had acted on the tip not because it contained evidence, but because it confirmed an assumption. And assumptions, when backed by a badge, turn into actions long before they turn into justifications. The word returned again, as it always did. "Show us your papers." Beatrice felt a flash of anger then, sharp and immediate, but she contained it. "What papers?" she asked again. "Be specific." Curtis frowned. "Your proof." "Proof of what?" "Citizenship." Beatrice shook her head. "There is no document I am required to carry to prove that." That was the part no one seemed willing to confront honestly. The United States does not have internal citizenship papers. There is no mandatory national ID. Birth certificates are not carried daily. Passports are optional and usually kept at home. Driver's licenses prove driving privileges, not citizenship. "So what exactly do you want?" she asked. "My birth certificate? From my desk drawer." Curtis said nothing. The children absorbed every word. Some would later remember the phrase papers with unease, although they could not yet articulate why it sounded wrong. "As an American citizen," Beatrice continued, "I do not carry proof of belonging with me, because belonging is not conditional. The demand for papers has a history. It is never neutral. It has always been used to separate those who are presumed legitimate from those who must prove themselves." Beatrice understood that instinctively, not because she had studied it formally, but because she had lived its consequences in subtler forms her entire life. "This is Arizona," she said quietly. "Not a border crossing, not a checkpoint. This is a classroom." Curtis's response was clipped. "You're making this worse." "No," she said. "I'm naming it." The room was silent now. Even the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed louder. Beatrice could feel the eyes of her students on her back, on Curtis, on the other officers who had yet to say a word. You are asking me to prove something the law does not require me to prove, she said. And you are doing it because of who you think I am. Curtis reached toward his belt. Turn around, he said again. Beatrice did not move. I am not resisting, she said. I am not obstructing. I am standing in my classroom and asserting my rights. The distinction mattered, and in that moment, it became clear that Curtis understood it, but chose to ignore it. Outside the frame of the classroom cameras, paperwork would later be written. Justifications would be constructed. But inside the room, the reality was plain. There were no papers to show. There never were. And the refusal to accept that truth was about to change everything. There was a simple action that would have prevented everything that followed, and it required neither force nor authority. It required restraint. Every school has procedures for a reason. Visitors report to the front office. Concerns about staff go through administrators. Employment records are verified internally because schools, by law, must already possess them. No teacher stands in front of a classroom without background checks, licensing verification, and work authorization having been reviewed and approved long before the first student ever takes a seat. Curtis Ray knew this. All 5 officers did. Yet none of them turned toward the administrative wing. None asked for the principal. None requested a roster, nor contacted human resources, nor asked a single neutral question that might have clarified the situation without harm. They bypassed every safeguard built to protect both staff and students, because those safeguards required patience, and patience would have delayed the confrontation they had already decided to have. Beatrice recognized the failure immediately. You should be speaking to the office, she said, because it was the most reasonable thing left to say. That's how this works? Curtis shook his head. We're handling it now. Handling it meant transforming a learning environment into a scene of suspicion. It meant asserting control where none was required. It meant treating an institution designed for children as though it were a crime scene, although no crime had been articulated. The other officers remained silent, although silence itself became a form of agreement. Logan Lowry stood near the door, blocking it without saying a word. Roland Hawkins positioned himself closer to the windows. Beck Colton and Edward Brandt hovered behind Curtis, close enough to communicate unity, far enough to avoid responsibility for the words being spoken. This was not an investigation. It was shortcut enforcement. Had Curtis walked to the office, he would have found Beatrice's personnel file within minutes. It would have included her hiring documents, her background check, her teaching license, her tax forms, her proof of authorization. It would have shown that she was exactly who she said she was, and that the anonymous tip carried no weight. But that path required acknowledging limits. And limits, to Curtis, felt like weakness. Instead, he chose the classroom. The procedural failure was not accidental. It was the result of a decision to prioritize suspicion over structure, authority over process, and control over care. That choice, made in seconds, would later unravel under scrutiny, because procedures exist precisely to prevent personal bias from becoming institutional harm. When Curtis reached for his handcuffs, the sound was unmistakable. Metal shifting against leather cut through the room, sharper than any raised voice. Several children gasped. One dropped her pencil again, but this time no one laughed or looked around to see who it belonged to. A boy in the second row slid his feet back under his chair, as if trying to make himself smaller. Turn around, Curtis said for the 3rd time. Beatrice felt the room tilt. Not because she was surprised, but because she understood what this would mean for the children behind her. She glanced toward them, meeting a few wide-eyed stares. She wanted to say something reassuring, but she knew anything she said now might be twisted into noncompliance. I am not resisting, she said clearly. I am not obstructing. Curtis moved closer. His presence alone changed the air. He took her arm, firm enough to communicate control, not yet rough enough to draw comment. The children watched, silent and unblinking, absorbing an image that would linger long after the day ended. A girl near the aisle began to cry, quietly, her face buried in her sleeve. Another child whispered, "Is she in trouble?" No one answered. The cuffs closed around Beatrice's wrists with a finality that made the moment irreversible. She flinched despite herself. The click echoed. Curtis turned her toward the door. "This is not your fault," Beatrice said, her voice steady, directed toward the students rather than the officers. "You stay seated." Those words mattered more than she could have known at the time. Several children later repeated them to their parents verbatim, clinging to them as proof that she had not abandoned them, even as she was being taken away. As they walked her past the desks, eyes followed her. Some children looked confused, others frightened, a few angry in ways they did not yet have language for. Authority had just taught them something without intending to. Teachers nearby stepped into the hallway as the classroom door opened. Astrid Wilcox froze when she saw Beatrice in cuffs. Jerry McIntyre's mouth fell open. Rebecca Huffman instinctively reached for her phone, then stopped, uncertain whether recording would make things worse. "What's going on?" someone asked. Curtis did not answer. The hallway cameras captured the procession from above. A teacher in handcuffs, officers flanking her, students peering through door windows. The image would later be replayed in slow, painful detail, but in that moment it unfolded in real time, relentless and indifferent to the damage it caused. For the children, the impact was immediate and profound. Adults they were taught to trust had violated the rules of their world. A teacher who represented safety had been rendered powerless. The message, though unspoken, was absorbed fully. Beatrice was escorted out of the building without explanation. The bell rang for recess as the door closed behind her, the normal rhythm of the school day continuing as if nothing had happened. The school security system captured the entry, the positioning of officers, the lack of engagement with administrators, and the arrest itself from multiple angles. Hallway cameras showed Curtis and his team bypassing the front office entirely. Classroom cameras recorded the exchange, the tone, the absence of any articulated suspicion. Exterior cameras captured the walk to the patrol cars. Witnesses filled in what cameras could not. Teachers described the disruption, the shock, the children's reactions. Staff confirmed that no administrator had been contacted before officers entered the classroom. Parents reported the immediate aftermath. Children coming home withdrawn, anxious, confused, some asking whether teachers could be taken away at any time. Curtis's incident report told a different story. He wrote of cooperation attempted, of a teacher who became evasive, of a situation that required immediate action. He referenced the anonymous tip repeatedly, as if repetition could substitute for substance. He described the classroom entry as necessary, the arrest as justified. Policy manuals contradicted him. School resource protocols explicitly required officer coordination with administrators unless there was an immediate threat to safety. There was none. Employment verification procedures assigned responsibility to the institution, not to officers confronting individuals. Fourth Amendment training materials emphasized that anonymous tips required corroboration before detention. Curtis had bypassed every safeguard. Internal review pulled radio logs. No call to the principal. No request for records. No attempt at verification. Just escalation. The officer's body cameras added another layer. Audio captured the demand for papers. Video showed Curtis ignoring Beatrice's questions, deflecting her request for a legal basis, dismissing the suggestion to involve administration. The footage showed his hand reaching for cuffs not after resistance, but after refusal to submit. Witnesses were interviewed. Ollie Adams recalled seeing Curtis block the classroom door. Stella described the silence in the room, the children frozen. Benicio remembered the moment the cuffs clicked. Each account aligned with the footage. The more evidence was reviewed, the narrower Curtis's explanations became. He had not acted out of urgency. He had acted out of assumption, an assumption when placed under scrutiny, collapses quickly. Once the footage was reviewed, the city moved quickly, but not decisively. Charges against Beatrice were dropped quietly. There was no press conference, no apology. The dismissal cited insufficient evidence and procedural concerns. The same anonymous tip that had justified the arrest was suddenly deemed inadequate. That was the civil side of the equation. Civil liability addresses harm by assigning monetary value to damage. It compensates. It deters, at least in theory. It does not, however, declare conduct criminal. It does not place handcuffs on those who abuse authority. It does not carry the weight of incarceration. Beatrice's attorneys understood this distinction clearly. A civil lawsuit could expose the wrongdoing, recover damages, and force policy changes. It could also leave an uncomfortable question unanswered. If a civilian knowingly violated the law, they would face criminal charges. If a government employee knowingly violated constitutional rights under color of law, the path to criminal accountability was far less certain. Curtis Ray had not misunderstood the law. He had been told directly what the Fourth Amendment required. He had ignored it. He had proceeded anyway. The question, therefore, was not whether he had made a mistake, but whether that decision carried consequences beyond a payout funded by taxpayers. Civil liability meant the city would pay. Criminal accountability would have meant Curtis himself face prosecution. The debate unfolded in parallel with the lawsuit. Should officers who knowingly violate rights be charged? Should qualified immunity shield conduct that training explicitly forbids? Should accountability stop at termination or extend further? The evidence suggested intent, not confusion. Curtis had chosen to escalate after being informed of the law. He had chosen the classroom over the office. He had chosen force over verification. Nevertheless, criminal charges were not filed. The legal system, as it stood, treated the violation as a civil wrong rather than a criminal act. That distinction frustrated many, because it implied that some violations of the law carried consequences only when measured in dollars, not in responsibility. Beatrice did not seek vengeance. She sought acknowledgement. She sought accountability that matched the harm done, not only to her, but to the children who witnessed the arrest and to the institution that had failed to protect them. The lawsuit moved forward. Depositions were scheduled. Discovery expanded. The city prepared its defense. And a question remained, unresolved but unavoidable. If the law applies to everyone, then what happens when those sworn to uphold it choose not to? By the time the case reached the courtroom, the facts were no longer in dispute. What remained contested was accountability. The city's defense rested on a familiar doctrine, one invoked so often that it had become almost reflexive: qualified immunity. The argument was framed carefully. The officers, the city claimed, had not acted with malice. They had acted in a gray area. The law, according to the defense, was not clear enough to hold them personally responsible. That claim collapsed under scrutiny. The Fourth Amendment does not contain ambiguity on unreasonable seizures. Demanding identification without reasonable suspicion is a seizure. Detaining a person for refusing an unlawful demand is retaliation. Entering a classroom without coordinating with administrators violates both policy and common sense. These principles were not emerging law. They were settled. Qualified immunity was never designed to protect knowing violations. It was intended to shield officials from liability when the law was unclear, not when it was ignored. Yet over time, the doctrine had expanded beyond recognition, becoming a near-automatic barrier between misconduct and consequence. Beatrice's legal team did not argue emotion. They argued about structure. Training materials entered into evidence showed that Curtis Ray had been instructed on reasonable suspicion standards repeatedly. Department policy manuals outline school engagement procedures explicitly. Prior case law in the jurisdiction mirrored federal precedent. There was no gap in understanding to hide behind. Curtis had been told the law. He had been corrected in real time. he had proceeded anyway. That distinction mattered. Individual liability became the fulcrum of the debate. Should officers who knowingly violate constitutional rights bear personal responsibility, or should every cost be absorbed by the public treasury? The defense insisted that holding officers individually accountable would chill policing. The plaintiffs countered that immunity had already chilled accountability. Witnesses testified about the effect of immunity on behavior. When consequences are abstract, misconduct becomes easier. When the bill is paid by someone else, deterrence weakens. Curtis Ray had acted confidently because he believed the system would absorb the fallout. Qualified immunity was no longer a shield for good faith error. It had become insulation for deliberate choice. The jury listened. They were not asked to decide whether policing was difficult. They were asked to decide whether the Constitution meant what it said. The verdict arrived without drama. After days of testimony, after hours of footage replayed frame by frame, after legal standards explained in plain language, the jury returned with a decision that required neither interpretation nor embellishment. Liability was established. The officers had violated Beatrice Dillon's Fourth Amendment rights. The arrest had been unlawful. The detention had been unjustified. The harm was real. Then came damages. $19.6 million. The figure was not symbolic. It was calculated. Jurors had been instructed to consider lost income, emotional distress, reputational harm, and the long-term psychological effects of public humiliation. They heard from child psychologists who explained how witnessing authority abuse alters a child's sense of safety. They heard from educators who testified about the professional damage caused by an arrest record, even one later dismissed. They also heard from experts on deterrence. Civil verdicts served two functions: compensation and warning. This verdict spoke to both. It compensated Beatrice for what had been taken from her, and it warned institutions that procedural shortcuts carry measurable cost. The city attempted to frame the award as excessive. Jurors rejected that framing. Excess, they concluded, had occurred in the classroom, not the courtroom. Curtis Ray sat expressionless as the number was read. He did not react when the judge confirmed it. He did not speak when reporters approached. His career, though not yet formally ended, had already become untenable. For the city, the verdict represented more than financial loss. It represented exposure. Training failures were now public record. Policy gaps were documented. Internal contradictions were illuminated. $19.6 million did not buy closure. It purchased clarity. The verdict established that constitutional violations are not theoretical harms. They are quantifiable, they are actionable, and they are expensive. Money, however, does not answer every question. As the case receded from headlines, a quieter debate intensified. If a civilian had knowingly violated the law in this way, would they have faced arrest? If a private security guard had entered a classroom, detained a teacher without cause, and traumatized children, would civil damages have been the end of it? The answer was uncomfortable. The law recognizes a category of wrongdoing that is neither mistake nor misunderstanding. It is willful disregard. Curtis Ray had been informed of the law. He had been warned. He had chosen escalation over compliance. That choice satisfied the elements of criminal conduct under any ordinary analysis. Yet criminal charges were never filed. Prosecutors cited discretion. They cited institutional concerns. They cited the difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt. None of those explanations satisfied the public conversation that followed. Should officers who knowingly violate constitutional rights face prison? The question was not radical. It was logical. Laws exist to restrain power. When those entrusted with enforcement become violators, accountability must travel upward, not evaporate. Critics argued that criminalizing misconduct would deter good officers. Others responded that accountability deters bad behavior, not good faith. The absence of consequence, they argued, had already proven corrosive. Beatrice did not campaign for imprisonment. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with the same restraint she had shown in the classroom. "This is not about revenge," she said. "It's about standards. Standards require enforcement. Without the possibility of criminal consequence, constitutional rights depend on civil litigation, which requires time, money, and resilience that many do not have. The system, as structured, placed the burden on victims to correct violations rather than on institutions to prevent them." The verdict closed the case. It did not close the debate, and perhaps it was never meant to. In the months that followed, Beatrice returned to teaching. The classroom looked the same. The desks were still arranged in rows. The whiteboard still bore lessons. But something fundamental had shifted, both for her and for those who watched. Children asked questions. Some asked why the officers had come. Others asked whether it could happen again. Beatrice answered honestly, but carefully. She explained the rules. She explained the rights. She explained that knowing the law was not disobedience. It's responsibility, she told them. The phrase, "know your rights," is often misunderstood. It is treated as a challenge, a provocation. In reality, it is a cornerstone of citizenship. Rights are not privileges granted by authority. There are limits placed upon it. Beatrice's case illustrated that distinction with painful clarity. She had not refused out of defiance. She had refused because the law did not require submission. She had asked questions because accountability demands explanation. She had remained calm because truth does not need volume. The officers mistook that composure for resistance. The system initially mistook the arrest for routine enforcement. Only evidence forced correction. Citizens do not carry papers because the Constitution does not require it. Identification is context-dependent, not universal. Suspicion must be articulated, not assumed. Authority must be justified, not presumed. These principles are neither abstract nor optional. They are operational. The final lesson of the case was not the size of the verdict. It was the clarity of the violation. Rights do not disappear in classrooms, nor at counters, nor in workplaces. They do not hinge on appearance, accent, or ancestry. Knowing your rights is not defiance. It is participation. And when citizens assert them, they're not obstructing the law. They are upholding it.